Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Greetings to all. We are here again today as part of this series of presentations that revolves about a very important issue, and we're all aware of that. And relevance has been facing an ever more challenging reality. Today, we have with us Dr. Emmanuel Kahan from Buenos Aires. The issue at hand has to do with the transition of defending human rights to fighting international terrorism as a way where he will analyze the changes in the uses of the memory of the Holocaust. I think we're all clear, very much clear, in that the issue of the use of memory and also forsakenness is a use of individual and collective identities. And as we will hear today, it has to do with relational identities. So the group that remembers and the society and the context within which there is that remembrance. Dr. Emmanuel Kahan is a PhD in history, has a PhD in history and a master's in history and memory from the National University of La Plata. He's a researcher at the National Council for Scientific and Technological Research in Argentina, and also a professor in the Department of History at the School of Humanities and Education Sciences at the University of La Plata, which has been at the forefront when it comes to many of the issues pertaining to human rights, discrimination, and certainly anti-Semitism as well. I would also like to underscore the role played by Emmanuel as one of the founding members of the Center for Jewish Studies based at the Institute for Economic and Social Development Studies in Argentina. This is a very interesting body, very important, that makes major contributions. And I'd like to thank Emmanuel for hosting me there to launch my book in full reciprocity to the presence here at UNAM and at our postgraduate, our graduate program here at UNAM, his presence here. He's a prolific author, and I think that his work shows certain specific issues and thematic lines of thought. And in 2025, he published with a couple of times, very interestingly, with our dear colleague Yael about the memory of the Holocaust, with an emphasis on temporality and stakeholders and the practices in national contexts, Argentina and Mexico. In 2025 still, he published a very interesting paper, well, not just interesting, but also a major question, because we always see the issue of Nazism, memory and negationism as a challenge, and he has a long track record, which I suggest you look up. He has focused on the Holocaust memory and recovery by groups and society as a whole of such memory. On the other hand, there is a book that he published that is also part of his research entitled Part of the Air: The Arab-Israeli Conflict in Argentine Culture and Politics. I believe that both of these thematic lines, both the Holocaust and the memory of the Holocaust and the conflict, they overlap and interact. And we'll hear today from him how this is a consequence of cognitive and ideological displacements and shifts, in this framework. And I'd like to welcome all of you for being here. I see some very well-known faces from dear colleagues who are very interested in this issue. issue. So without further ado, welcome, Emmanuel. Thank you, Judith, and good morning,
Muchas
good
gracias,
afternoon, good
Judith.
evening to
Bueno, buenos
one
días,
and
buenas
all.
tardes o
As
buenas noches
Judith
a
was
todos y a
saying,
todas.
it is
Como
an
decía Judith, para
honor
mí es
and a
un
matter
profundo
of great
honor y
pride to be
orgullo
part of
formar
this
parte
series of
nuevamente de este
international
seminario
workshops
internacional
about different
dedicado
scenarios
a pensar
involving
los
anti-Semitism
escenarios
in Latin
relativos
America.
al
And to do this,
antisemitismo en América Latina y
surrounded
sobre
by
todo
such
hacerlo con
dear
gente tan
colleagues
querida y con la que
that
hemos
have been
venido
part
pensando y
of
debatiendo
the
estos
research
temas
and the
desde hace
thought
tiempo.
about
Como
this.
dijo Judith, tenemos un círculo
Judith
de
and
exalumnos
I
de
go a
muchos años.
long
Es
way
mi maestra
back,
intelectual
and
en
way
parte
back, and she was my
tuvimos parte de aire,
intellectual
siempre se ha escribido en un diálogo con ella,
teacher,
en
and she is
intercambio
my
muy
guide.
fluido.
We started talking about
Judith fue
the
Irlanda,
Six
tuve
Day
la
War
recepción
and
de
what
ella
it
durante
meant
6 días
internationally, and
en
that's how
escala
we started.
internacional.
And
Y a
then
partir
I
de ahí
started
establecimos como un
working on the
pasillo
chapter
intercambio sobre
about
Argentina
Argentina.
que
It's part
reconocíamos
of a
mutuamente.
book. It
En el
included
libro ese estaba
a
el municipio
chapter
de
by
Leonardo
Leonardo
Segman,
Segman,
yo
but I
pensaba que había
felt
que
that there
dar
was
cuenta
a
de esa
need for
dimensión más
more work to
amplia
be done
de la resolución del
about the
conflicto,
conflict
cómo
and
hizo
how it was
Judith Bendrich en
received by
tantos
different
grupos propios de
stakeholders,
la
not
comunidad
just the Jewish
judía
community,
y
but
también en
other
sectores más
different stakeholders in the
seculares y
political
hacia
and
la política
cultural
cultural del
scenes
país.
of this country. I will be
En mi
talking,
caso,
giving
hoy voy a
you
presentar una serie de
some of
reflexiones
my ideas
o
about the
consideraciones
uses
sobre
of the memory of
los
the
usos
Holocaust
justamente
and
de la memoria del
anti-Semitism in my
Holocausto y del
country, Argentina,
antisemitismo en
throughout
Argentina, en mi
the
país,
last few years, starting
en los últimos años, particularmente desde la asunción de
with the
Javier Milei,
taking of
pero esto
office
merecería
of
mucha, mucha más
Javier
presentación,
Milei, and
empieza
how
como a
the
cambiar los sentidos
significance
de este
and the
asunto
sense
y esta
of
memoria
these
en el espacio público en los últimos 10 15 años
denunciation and
en la
these
política argentina y del país.
have changed. And
Para
I will
eso voy a
also
hacer una
talk about
primera referencia también a
anti-Semitism
la
in
cuestión de la
Argentina in
perspectiva
general,
argentina,
because maybe for
porque
many of
quizás
you,
para muchos de
I mean,
ustedes,
there's
para
no
muchos de
reason
ustedes,
why you should
no
know
tienen por qué
how
saber qué es lo
the
que, cómo se ha
narratives
construido en las
of
más décadas
anti-Semitism in my country
en mi
have
país
evolved
y qué
throughout
ha
the
pasado con
20th
él a
and
lo largo de
21st
este
century thus
momento del
far.
siglo XX y lo que
I
vamos hacia el
have
futuro.
put
Bueno, voy
together
a
a
acompañar la
PowerPoint
presentación,
presentation
voy a presentar
to
un PowerPoint
facilitate
para
my
hacer más, más
speech.
amena
Can you
la presentación.
confirm that you
¿Me
can see
están
my
viendo? ¿Se ve? ¿Me
presentation,
hacen una
Judith?
seña?
Yes.
Sí.
So,
Bueno,
first of
ahora
all,
se
let
ve.
me just say that
La
anti-Semitism
primera
in
tiene que ver con que
Argentina
efectivamente
has a long
antisemitismo en
track
Argentina
record.
tiene una larga
As
tradición, una larga
maybe you
trayectoria.
have
Como
seen from
quizás lo han
some
trabajado
historians who
mejor
have
nuestros
devoted
historiadores que
a
han
large part of
consagrado
their
gran parte
research
de
to
su
this, such as
historia
Leonardo
a
Segman,
trabajar este
who will
aspecto.
be at the
Leonardo
end of
Segman
this
va
seminar,
a
such as
enriquecer
and
el
Daniel Bovich,
seminario
an
como Daniel
Argentine
Bovich, un
from the
historiador argentino
University of
de la
Sarmiento,
Universidad Nacional de Sarmiento.
said
El antisemitismo
anti-Semitism
en
in
Argentina se
Argentina is part of
explica
a
como parte
global
de una experiencia
experience.
global,
It has to do
básicamente como
with
parte, como la
the
configuración del ideario del antisemitismo moderno
imaginary
desde los fines del
of
siglo XIX y gran parte
Argentine
del siglo
society
XX,
since the
pero
19th and
que
20th
a la vez
century.
que
So
traduce
aside
esas
from these
imágenes
images of the
proyectadas
Jews,
sobre
it's
los
also
judíos,
adapted
también las
to the
adapta a las
specificities of
experiencias del
local
territorio local o de
history
la historia
and
nacional.
territory.
Entonces, de alguna
So the
manera, las
pejorative
representaciones connotadas o peyorativas
undertones
sobre los
that
judíos
emerged towards
que
the late
emergen en
19th
la
century
modernidad
about
en el
Jews
siglo
as a
XIX como
conspirator
el sujeto que es
promoting
conspirador, aquel que promueve la
social
revolución social,
revolution and
aquel que es
communism, but at the
comunista,
same
pero que a la
time
vez es el que
destabilizes
altera
markets through
la estabilidad de los
speculation, for
mercados,
example,
altera la
financial
especulación,
speculation.
etcétera.
All of
Todas
those
esas
ideas,
representaciones que se
concepts developed
construyen sobre todo en los centros
in urban
como mundo en
centers,
Europa, en
especially
los
in
centros
Europe, also came
metropolitanos,
to
se
Argentina, but
traduce
were
también en la
adjusted to the
Argentina, pero de alguna manera
specificities of our
adaptándola
own
también
national
ahora a las
history. And
especificidades
as
de la historia
opposed to
nacional. Quizás incluso a la
the
influencia de
global
lo que ocurre
anti-Semitism,
en
in
forma a
Argentina,
escala global, es que el
anti-Semitism
antisemitismo en
was
Argentina va a ser más bien,
ongoing, but at the
podríamos
same
decir, como
time
constante, pero a
episodic.
la
There
vez
were
episódico. Es decir,
spikes
momentos de
in
mayor envergadura,
visibility
de mayor visibilidad,
and
y
relevance,
momentos
and
donde de alguna manera
sometimes
desaparece o se
it becomes
minimiza
less
el
visible
debate
in
público.
public
En la
debate.
década de
So it's
1930, por
become
ejemplo,
one
más o
of the
menos
central
uno de los
aspects in the
aspectos centrales
1930s, the
vertebradores
issue
del
of the
debate
presence
público,
of
la
the
cuestión
Jews
de
and
la
how they
presencia
are related
judía y su
and
vínculo al
ties
comunismo y
to
demás. Lo
communism. And then
mismo
in the
luego en la
60s,
década del 60,
against the
cuando,
backdrop of
como
the
el caso
Eichmann
Eichmann de
case, there
fondo,
was
se sospeche
suspicion
sobre
about how
la
loyal
lealtad de los
Jews were
judíos al Estado
to
argentino.
Argentina, and
Y ahí también se introduce esta idea de que
and
los
hence
judíos no
the
son leales al
idea
país,
that
sino que son leales
Jews
al
are
Estado de
not loyal
Israel.
to Argentina but to
Finalmente, en
Israel.
la
And
década
then
del
in the 60s
70,
and
recientemente la
70s,
última dictadura
there is a
militar
different
durante los últimos
situation
décadas
whereby
de la
some
dictadura de Fidel,
Jews due to their involvement in political organizations, were persecuted by the military regime. And then in the late 90s and towards the end of the 20th century, there were two major terrorist attacks, one against the Israeli embassy and another one against AMIA. Because, these were two major moments in terms of anti-Semitism in the country. But throughout the 20th century, what we see are episodes in that dot the long history of our Jewish presence in the country. So all of these representations feed on the anti-Semitism globally and condemning the presence of Jews due to their involvement in social movements, in companies, in financial markets, and also left-wing movements. What's very interesting and maybe unique about Argentina vis-a-vis Latin America is that this early discussion about Jews and anti-Semitism led to, as a consequence, the existence of several institutions of different nature that represent the denouncement of anti-Semitism and become a vehicle for the representation of Jews in Argentina. In 1935, DIA was created, and so were other organizations that throughout time, in order to fight anti-Semitism, gained acknowledgement in the public sphere. Still, I always like to cite Renan Ryan because sometimes if you just focus on literature about the history of the Jews in Argentina in the 20th century, you might come up with the idea that anti-Semitism was maybe not the backbone, but essential in the socialization of Jews in Argentina. But those of us who live here and have studied the presence of Jews in the 20th and 20th century in this country know that that is not true. Anti-Semitism is, of course, there. It's episodic. It does spike in times, but without a doubt, Jewish life in the country has gone on smoothly, relatively smoothly, and their integration and the pluralization of their identities have been quite unique throughout the 20th century. And going back to my last meeting with Judith in Buenos Aires a couple of months ago, if we were to look at what happened in Buenos Aires within the context of the Gaza conflict vis-a-vis the situation in Mexico or elsewhere, we can just conclude that in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, anti-Semitism was somehow marginal. It was not as at the forefront as was the case in other countries and universities and so on and so forth. Now, anti-Semitism, as Judith was saying, and that's what I do, we study this, and that's always been tied to the memory of the Holocaust. My first research paper was about the Eichmann case in 1960, 61, and 62, and it revolved around the debates about the arrest of the Nazi criminal. And then I focused on the experience regarding Jewish life in the 1960s. And from then on, with an emphasis on debate about anti-Semitism, persecution of Jews, etc. And as I said a minute ago, the 1960s were times of a great deal of presence of the Jews in public debate and in the public sphere in our country. And as I moved ahead with my research, I realized that the presence of anti-Semitism in these debates was never in isolation, or it did not clash with the debates about the memory of the Holocaust or its reconfiguration, and also the way the Arab-Israeli conflict had throughout since the 1960s. For example, the Six-Day War in 1967, and after the Eichmann case in 1961, 62, 60, 61, 62, any movements purporting that Jews were against the Argentinian state led to several public ceremonies, and such as that of the Luna Park Stadium. And this is it. This is a poster of that convening that public rally against Nazism, where one of the survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto was also present and spoke. Her name is Sylvia Lubletkin. And so this is part and has been part of the political and cultural debate in our country throughout the 20th century, but especially during the second half of the 20th century. So when I speak of memory of the Holocaust and changes, this is not separate from the uses or connotations having to do with anti-Semitism and how it's perceived in Argentina. In Argentina, as is the case of the United States or in France, the issue of the memory of the Holocaust had an early impact. And that was spoken about from Anna Laczynski up until Yossi Goldstein, who's here with us today, by the way, who have said that public sensitivity since the 1960s, excuse me, since the 1950s, has been present in public debate. Now, the pivotal moment of how the memory of the Holocaust permeated and expanded towards a broad universe of stakeholders in Argentina that went beyond the Jewish community and Jewish institutions was the latest military dictatorship between 1966 and 83. And early on, a representation of the military regime was created as if emulating in a certain way, but in a smaller way, what Nazism was in Europe. And the idea of the persecution of the Jews was used as a lens to challenge and criticize the military regime internationally. So starting in 76, at the beginning of the regime, the first campaigns, and it began by questioning and challenging the persecutions by the military dictatorship, and purporting that the junta, the first junta, was similar to the Nazi regime in Europe. And one of the most important pieces of literature about this was written by Jacobo Timerman, one of the major stakeholders in terms of public opinion, who was arrested in 1977 and then released in 1979. He was, first of all, forcefully disappeared. Then he went on to a different regime. He was clandestinely detained and then legally detained. And then he was released but expatriated. He was first, he went to Israel and then to the United States, where he wrote and published his testimonial, Nameless Prisoner, Cell Without a Number, which was then turned into a film by NBC, which 2 years before had broadcast the series Shoah. And here are the flyers of the film. These are very well-known actors, Roy Schneider and Liv Ullmann. And the film, above and beyond its artistic value, was very much a matter of public debate in 1981 and 82 when it was released in the United States. This consecration of the memory of the Holocaust in a certain way sets at the center of the denouncement of the military regime, how this regime violates human rights and especially persecutes Jews and its way of life, the Jews and their way of life and their institutions. And the idea of denouncing was consecrated not during the dictatorship, but after the dictatorship in 1983. It ended, and then came the first democratic regime under Raúl Alfonsín in 83 and 84. And then there's the idea of never again, no, we will not forget, we will not forgive. And that was part of what led Argentina after the dictatorship. And these became not just part of denunciation, but also not only about so creating a link between what happened under the Nazis and under the military dictatorship. So there were several stakeholders, Marshall Meyer and Sheeler and others, who some had to do with the Jewish community, some others, such as the Plaza de Mayo mothers and others, and saying that what happened in Argentina was like a small Holocaust. And and the idea was that it be that there be solidarity, and in that the military regime was one that violated human rights, that there should be an investigation, that there should be that victims should be heard, their testimonials during the dictatorship in terms of repression, persecution, and extermination, and the memory of the Holocaust and that of the dictatorship in Argentina become intertwined to become to lend legitimacy to each other. And this is interesting. Jesse Goldstein said this in a very interesting paper. It says that this memory, there's a solidarity between these two types of memory, and they create a basis to be able to understand that what happened in Argentina emulates another fact that happened in the 20th century at a global scale. And it also creates an interaction between Jewish history and, and international global human rights bodies, and which is sometimes are harmonious and sometimes they're at odds. And what we said at the beginning is that this has to do with the way stakeholders receive the various moments in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And there's a moment that consecrates the solidarity in terms of the memory of the Holocaust and the military regime as integrating human rights. This is a cartoon whose point was to follow a student at at a school in terms of what happened in genocide during the 20th century. And Frank, in terms of the Holocaust, then the Armenian genocide, and the Guatemalan genocide as well. And this was created by the Ministry of Education as part of a campaign to teach about the memory of the Holocaust and other genocides where the Holocaust became a lens of sorts to understand other such events. Now, this matrix of interaction between the memory of the Holocaust and human rights began to be challenged towards the mid 2020s. And why is that? Because in 2015, 2016, where there was a change in the government and the Kirchners left the presidency and were replaced by Mauricio Macri, the first thing that happened was that this relationship between the memory of the Holocaust and of the military dictatorship in terms of agents of the state was separated. So events in remembrance of the Holocaust, January 27th, or in April, those hosted by the Jewish community, there weren't, when government officials were involved, there wasn't a real link drawn between the two elements, the military dictatorship and the memory of the Holocaust. But rather, the issue of the Holocaust became a unique fact in 20th century history, not related to other events. And so there is a shift in this link between the memory of the Holocaust and the human rights agenda, which came to a head under President Milei in late 2023 and early 2024. One may say that what happened is that the reading by Javier Milei and other libertarians have of the Holocaust have something to do with this. But during the presidential campaign for the presidential elections in Argentina, there was what happened right before that was October 7th, 2023, with the massacre perpetrated by Hamas in Israeli territory. So this reinterpretation of the memory of the Holocaust against the backdrop of the post October 7th massacre and under Javier Milei will no longer focus on what this meant in terms of the military relationship, but rather a reinterpretation of the current situation, saying that what went on in Israel in October 2023 just unveils to the rest of the world that the West is under attack and under threat. So here in 2023, in October, Javier Milei forcefully condemned what Hamas's actions and restated once again Israel's right to exist, but also later on during Holocaust remembrance events, this memory of the Holocaust is seen within the framework of Israel as being the last outpost of the fight against extremism and Islamic terrorism, and that the need for the West to defend the State of Israel as a guarantor of universal freedom. So Javier Milei is one of those voices that spoke in that regard, but not the only one by any means. And this is interesting because, as is the case in many of our countries, there are rallies in the streets of Buenos Aires, and I'm talking about not in different parts of the country, not just in Buenos Aires, where there are expressions of solidarity towards the State of Israel, and also condemnation of the State of Israel and support for the Palestinian cause. Right after in 2023, in 2024, in 2025, we saw how the Arab-Israeli conflict once again sparked public debate. What often happens is that these rallies and mobilization for support and solidarity and demands for the return of the hostages had a different dimension, which is the instrumentalization of the use of the memory of the Holocaust to persecute those opponents of Milei. So we see two sides of a coin. There are large rallies such as this one that happened in October, November 2023 out in the streets of Buenos Aires. There were many of them even thereafter. And then there were other initiatives taken by organizations that were not very large, or very small actually, but that claimed to represent Jewish identity in the country and fight anti-Semitism, whose proposal was to rename a street that was called State of Palestine with Biba's family. So instead of sparking solidarity towards the hostages, but it sparked discrimination and anti-Semitism in left-wing movements in the country. And this is interesting because these rallies and these reinterpretations of Nazism and Holocaust were not only around the memory of the Holocaust, but also by reinterpreting the experience of Nazism. And so there was something very similar going on between what Milei did and the Bolsonaro regime in Brazil that strongly identified with the State of Israel and the identity and of Jews and their position. But academically speaking, this was a very whimsical interpretation of what the National Socialist experience was by reinterpreting history and as if the Hitler's regime had been socialist and left-wing, and referring to its not so much to its authoritarian dimension, but rather left-wing and socialist dimension. So what we heard from Millet and his followers was that, and oftentimes was that the had to do with how that the state was so authoritarian during Nazism because they were left wing, and that the left, the global left, was to be blamed for what happened. So this was no longer a memorialistic discussion, but rather a historical one. And I think it's interesting for us to think about this. This is food for thought, because over the last few years, we have endeavored to challenge, to debate how left-wing movements in their anti-Zionist dimension have fed on classic anti-Semitism or classical anti-Semitism sources, and we see that in Judith Boxer's works. But those of us who are on the other side, and we believe in the legitimacy of the State of Israel, and we don't question that, to what extent we can't counter how the right-wing movements that were anti-Semitic in many ways were directly linked to certain ideas and the imaginary in the State of Israel, and this came into the public sphere and changed democratic sociability. And this is a very important book that synthesizes the history of anti-Semitism. This was written by our colleague Alejandro Baer in Spain, Anti-Semitism, the Eternal Return of the Jewish Question, analyzing in Europe and especially in Spain how anti-Semitism has evolved over the last few years, and where we can see the anti-Semitism of left-wing movements and right-wing movements, and how they both feed on a caricaturesque representation of the State of Israel, and how the last outpost of the defense of freedom of the West in the context of this global conflict. And it's important to understand the combinations, the uniqueness, the plurality, and the differentiation between the State of Israel itself, and how sometimes that's overlooked in current debate about anti-Semitism, at least in national context, at least in Argentina, and based on what I've seen in Latin America in general terms. Finally, in order to conclude,
para
This is a
imaginarse y
more, this idea has more to do
ideas
with
más
the
vinculadas al mundo
history
del
of the
Holocausto,
Holocaust.
me parece
I believe that it's
esencial y de alguna
interesting, at
manera
least in the case of
indispensable poder
Argentina, to
pensar, al
think
menos en
about how
etapa
the long
temprana,
history of
cómo
anti-Semitism in
entender la
our
historia
country,
del antisemitismo en nuestro
and
país,
as opposed to other
que a
times when
diferencia de
this
otros momentos
anti-Semitism
donde ese
escalated
antisemitismo
in
cayó
when
en
globally in the
contextos donde el
1930s, in the
antisemitismo salió a escala
60s, in the
global, la
70s,
década del 60, la década del
1975, when the
60, la década del
UN
70, 75, cuando
equated
Naciones Unidas
Zionism to
equipara
racism. What
el
happened in
antisemitismo como una forma
Argentina
de
over the
racismo,
last few
lo que pasó
years,
en Argentina, por lo menos en los últimos
against the
años, en el
backdrop of
contexto
the
del
Gaza
conflicto en
conflict, did
Gaza,
not
no
escalate
escaló, sí,
to
a la
levels
magnitud
such
que
as those of
sucedió en
Mexico, United
Latinoamérica, por
States, France,
ejemplo, en
Spain,
México, en
and Great
Estados Unidos,
Britain.
en
I
España, en
think we're
Francia,
faced with a
etcétera.
different and new
Ahí me parece
scenario.
que
And the
estamos frente a un nuevo
question that I'd
escenario
like to leave you
y
with
habría que ver,
is
es una pregunta que
to
dejo,
what
cuánto
extent
tuvo que
the
ver
impact
el
and
impacto, vamos a
non-resolution
decir, el impacto
of
y no
the
resolución,
attack on
¿sí? Del
AMIA
atentado a
in
la AMIA, sí, de
1994 was a
1994.
factor here. So
Yo por mi
this
parte
concludes my
dejo
presentation,
aquí
Judith,
y
and
quedo
I will be
abierto
glad
para
to entertain
preguntas en
questions.
el
Thank
resto
you.
del tiempo.
That's what I was going to say.
Eso te iba a
Emmanuel,
decir, de
thank you
contar.
so
Muchas
much.
gracias, Emmanuel. Creo que
This
el tema es un tema
you
realmente que
came up with several
presenta
questions as
todas
well,
las
and
incógnitas
that
más
you posed us.
profundas.
Before
Antes de
we
pasar
begin
al diálogo con
this
quienes nos
dialogue
acompañan,
and this
quiero por
answers
favor
and questions and
agradecer
answers. I'd
el
like to thank
servicio
Luis Fleischman.
a
He
Luis
is
Fleischman,
co-organizing
que
this
es
series. I'd
co-conductor y
also like to thank
realizador de esta
Sharona, our
serie.
interpreter.
Quiero
Sharona
agradecer
Walkovich
a
is our
Sharona
interpreter into English,
Volkovich, que es
and El
nuestra
Shaddai,
traductora
who
al
just came
inglés,
back
y a El Shaddai, que ha
on
regresado,
behalf
no
of
ahora, no está,
ISGAP.
representando el
And thank you for your
apoyo y el
support.
marco de
Now,
ISGAP.
with that,
Dicho
Emma,
esto,
Emmanuel.
mira, Emma, vamos a ver,
I see
pero
Yossi, I see
quiero decir
Sergio, I see
también adiós,
Florinda,
adiós
and I
Sergio,
see
Florinda y
Romina,
a
Luis
todos los
Ronian,
invitados más, a
and
Romina, a Luis Ronian,
Valeria.
quienes hemos estado, a
I
Valeria,
think that we're all
que
here,
no sé, me parece que estamos todos compartiendo
all concerned
una
about the new
preocupación por las
developments
transformaciones que
that
usted
you
comenta y que
also
está señalando.
spoke
Mientras
about.
te oía,
And while I was listening to you,
estoy
what came to
pensando
mind, especially when you
sobre todo
pointed
como
out, and rightly
señalabas y
so,
adecuadamente, claro,
what you
la,
call
lo que tú
the
llamas en
Israelization
tus
of
trabajos
memory,
la
right?
israelización de la memoria,
Um,
cuando la memoria se
Connecting
proyecta ya directo del
the
holocausto
memory
con
of the
el
Holocaust to the
sumismo en el
state of
Estado de
Israel and
Israel,
Zionism,
etcétera.
etc.
Y estaba
It's such a
pensando, piensan
paradoxical
ustedes que el
time that we are
verdadero
experiencing
establecimiento,
now,
lo que
and
estoy
that's something I'd
hablando
like
ya
to bring up here.
correcto.
The
Y es el hecho
different
de que tanto los
spatial and
referentes
temporal
espaciales y los temporales de la construcción
references
de
in
la
terms
memoria
of building memory
tienen una
have
transformación
changed
total, porque el espacio no es
very
geometría
dramatically
y el
because
tiempo
space
es
is
un
not
tiempo no lineal.
memory
¿A qué me
and time is
refiero?
nonlinear.
Básicamente,
So
de
there's
un
the
lado
idea of
empieza
the
la
attack
concepción del
mounted
ataque a
on the West
Occidente
and then the
y en el
global
otro
South.
el sur
One of them
global.
is the principle
Uno como
of reason, and
principio de la
the other one
razón,
is
el otro
a
como
venue for
espacio de
emancipation.
emancipación.
So
Y la
our
verdad es que nuestra
memory, our
memoria no es
Jewish
el
and
sionismo
Israeli
judía
memory
y de Israel
identity
queda
is very much
intervenido de
involved
modo
in
muy
this and
fuerte
has
desde el
become
siglo
even
XIX.
more
Creo que has
involved in this
planteado
since October 7th.
aspectos
So your
interesantes
presentation is very interesting. So I'd like to
y
invite
bueno,
you
quiero abrir ahora el
to
diálogo,
ask
quiero
questions if
invitarlos,
you'd
si
like
quieren hacer
to
algunas
make
preguntas,
comments.
algunos
Let
aportes,
us get started,
pero
please,
iniciar esta conversación,
because
¿correcto?
what Emma just
Creo que lo
said
que nos ha planteado
is
Emma es de gran
very
riqueza
interesting, and it's a wealth of information
vamos a
that
avanzar
provides us
vamos a
with food for
pensar
thought about the categories
necesitamos repensar
that
también los
we are
componentes
using to
con los
broach
cuales
a changing
estamos
reality.
abordando una
Yossi, did
realidad
you raise your
cambiante.
hand? So please go
Yo si
ahead.
tú levantaste la mano, por
Please
favor,
turn on your
adelante.
microphone.
Tienes que
Hi, Yossi,
quitártelo,
and I'm
exacto. Hola,
sorry
Yossi.
because I have
Hola, me
a case
disculpo,
of
tengo
bronchitis
mala
and my
coordinación
voice
con
isn't
Luis,
what it usually
pero
is.
no
I'm a bit
quería
hoarse, but
perderme
I would like I
oportunidad
wanted
de
to
escucharlo a
listen to
Emmanuel
Manuel once
y a
again. And
su
thank you
ponente
for
en su
quoting me
trabajo.
and mentioning me
Lo que
in
quería
my work.
comentar y
Judith, What I'd like to ask about is the Israelization of memory, and the how these two the confluence between that and Argentina and what's going on in Argentina. So, because the main symbol of the memory of the Holocaust that points to terrorism in general is, I believe, part of the impact cause created by Israel. On the other hand, it's not a linear process, if I may say. We're talking about conflicting memories in general, because Marshall Meyer's line was never accepted as the mainstream for the memory of the Holocaust in Argentina. And its link to human rights was never taken on by our community, the community establishment. And that needs to be said. The creation of the Holocaust Museum in Buenos Aires in 1994 was one, and then the creation of the House of Anna Frank, which is currently a museum that is more universalistic and more in tune with Marshall Meyer's line of thinking. And Hector Shalom and Silvina Chemen, the directors, met in Israel with the director of the Anne Frank Foundation in the Netherlands, from the Netherlands, to come up with ways to be in touch and work with human rights organizations in Israel. So, what I'm trying to present here is a dilemma that stems from your presentation as well, Emmanuel, but I think is very important for us to clarify. Thank you. Thank you, Yossi.
Gracias, Yossi.
Gracias, Yossi, gracias.
Let's keep going. Florinda, please, you have the floor. Thank
Ah,
you.
Florinda,
And
adelante.
hi, Emmanuel.
Gracias.
Emmanuel, if I
Hola,
may,
Emmanuel.
I'd like to add
Emmanuel, permitime
to your
agregar a
recount of events in commemoration of, in memory of the Holocaust, one that came before the one that you mentioned, and in which organization I was a part. In 1963, the Zionist University Center organized an event to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. We did not invite the public in general public, but university students. It was 1963, mind you. So the Eichmann case was still there, and the event was carried out at the main hall, in the main hall of the University of Buenos Aires, and people, it was completely full. People were watching even through the windows. And on behalf of Israel and the ghetto fighters, we had Heike Grossman, and one of our speakers was the legendary now Alfredo Palacios, and we opened up to a broader dimension even of the history through one of our speakers, and that was the president of the Spanish Republic in exile, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head. And I'm bringing this up because this was an event that was extremely important and had a great widespread resounded widespread in a widespread manner at the time. And I just wanted to bring it up. And thank you, Florinda.
Gracias,
And
Florinda.
by the way, if you like, I have pictures.
Si alguien quiere, tengo
Yes, that would be interesting. Thank you.
Ah,
Sí,
cómo
por
no.
favor.
Interesante. Sí,
Um,
interesante. Fíjense,
Just
en toda la
to
riqueza de
to
esta
to
conversación, quiero
what goes to show
profundizar
how
algo
the
que
wealth
es,
of this
que es necesario
conversation
tener en cuenta,
is
y es
something that
precisamente el concepto mismo de holocausto.
that is
En este
very
momento, el
powerful,
concepto
which is the
holocausto
shift
está
of the
aplicado
concept
a
of the
Gaza,
Holocaust, which is now
y
being
la víctima
applied to
viene
Gaza, and the
legitimando,
victim became the
es
victimizer.
exactamente el proceso
And that has to do with the process that has led to the delegitimization of Zionism and the challenging of Zionism as Zionists being perpetrators and criminals. And this goes back to the Soviet era as well. So when we talk about the memory of the Holocaust, many of the graffiti on the walls of UNAM equate Holocaust to what is being, quote unquote, perpetrated by Israel in Gaza. So a great deal has been written about the dynamics, about the interaction between the memory of the Holocaust in Israel and Palestine, the appropriation, the expropriation, and interaction in that regard. But that has become extremely dramatic lately, and it is worth our while to bear that in mind. If I may jump in, I would like to start responding to some of the comments and questions. One thing that I found very important about the three contributions, and I'll start with Judith and Yossi, is the Israelization of memory. I think that something that I really like about Judith is about how she calls on us to think about the reconceptualization of categories. And this is something novel about, it's not Bauman's debate, you know, and things have changed. As Judith was saying, many of these debates have diffused geographies and timelines or temporalities. So what I'm saying is that the memory of the Holocaust was one that underpinned the human rights agenda since the 1960s, when Heike Grossman visited the country in 63 and 68, and Claude Lanzmann as well. This memory condemned the persecution of the Jews in the Soviet Union. It also had to do with the Cold War, just like the Nazism persecuted Jews in Europe. Now Stalin and his supporters also persecute the Jews, and the memory of the Holocaust throughout the time has been seen in ways that overlapped, as Judith said, etc., and were simultaneous. But the reference to the historical event itself was central. So it was a memorial, but historical. But what happened lately with the Israelization of the memory of the Holocaust, it's that the memory of the Holocaust began to be used as a barrier, not to be at the center of the commemorative agenda. If you look at, let me explain this. If you look at what happened with Javier Milei after October 7th, there are no references to the Holocaust when talking about the Holocaust and the memory of the Holocaust. They talk about Hamas, about Israel, and about what happened on October 7th. So, and the survivors of October 7th just talk about Israel and Hamas. So there's a shift where what is at the center is no longer Israel as a representation, as an imaginary of the rights of the West, which is what our colleague from Brazil, from Rio de Janeiro, said about the representation of this imaginary and rights. And this is what I call Israelization of the memory of the Holocaust. So the Holocaust shifts to the side, and it's Israel that becomes the center of the memory of the persecution of the Jews, and not the Holocaust. And that is very significant. I think that the problem, conceptually speaking, is that this erasure, this shift of the memory of the Holocaust, setting aside of the memory of the Holocaust, leads to the setting aside of the human rights agenda, and what becomes the backbone of the representations of the current political times is the fight against international terrorism. So going back to Yossi, I believe that, as you said, rightly so, the memory of the Holocaust was not unidirectional, was not a one-way street in Argentina. It was multi-directional, as Michael Rothberg said, and this has to do with the classic texts. And Alejandro Baer said something really interesting. Rotner criticizes those who purport that who claim that Gaza is the Warsaw of the 21st century. First of all, Gaza is not Warsaw, and what happens is it does not create empathy. What it creates is a competition between these two issues and does not allow for us to see the drama of history. But Alejandro Baer said that Hamas is also not Hitler, just like Gaza is not Warsaw. These are two different concepts. So what happens is that these two representations end up being a lens for the understanding of the historical drama, and those are being weaponized in a way, and that needs to be on the table in academia. And I have spoken about this with my colleagues. Romina is here, Olivia is here from Chile, and we have people from Mexico. In our universities, it seems that there are no avenues for dialogue and understanding. The scenario currently is one of great belligerence, but we should not give up on our ability to analyze things and bring to the fore categories and concepts and specific historical aspects. And somebody had raised their hand. But before that, if I may, Emmanuel, I'd like to say that when you have to deal with the fact that an incidence of barbarism such as October 7th is defined by hegemonic voices and trends in academia as a venue for emancipation of the Palestinian people, well, then we're faced with this phenomenon, which entails extreme polarization and moralization. And this does call for ongoing systematic work, without a doubt. And I don't know if there was somebody else wanted to say something. Sergio, we see you and welcome. I know that you're writing a great deal about the Holocaust and about October 7th. Good afternoon. My point of view is mainly about Western Europe Jews. But I have a question. First of all, I don't know whether the International Day of Memory is celebrated in Latin America. In certain countries, in Argentina, it's an official day of remembrance. Yes, Sergio. So I have a question in that case. I am involved especially with intellectuals, Italian and French intellectuals, and Swiss intellectuals. So my proposal for the last 2 years already, that is since October 7th, was to boycott the day for memory or by the Jews. Because of the atmosphere in academia and the colonization of the Day of Remembrance, and by academics, by intellectuals who signed documents and declarations against Israel and against many Jews who identify with Israel throughout the world and their identification with Israel. I mean, there is no sense in participating, taking part in these activities, I believe. I mean, if you want, you can have them because it's your remembrance, your memory, not ours. It's not a Jewish Remembrance Day. It's the remembrance of people who perpetrated certain acts. And it would be nice if that were to be agreed upon, but it's not really my problem, quite frankly. It's a difficult world that we're living in, and I'm used to it. Especially those of us who are very old, like myself, and who is a survivor, as a Shoah survivor. So my question is the following, Emmanuel, what is your take on this idea of boycotting the Day of Remembrance? Do you think it would be right for us to be involved, to have Jewish presence in the context, context that is as hostile as the one we're living in? Thank you, Sergio.
Gracias,
I will
Sergio.
answer
Yo voy a responder con eso,
based on my own
siempre
personal experience and
con toda mi propia
also
experiencia personal y
in
nacional.
Argentina. January
En Argentina, el
27th
acto primero es un
is
acto
a
oficial
National
que
Day of
incluso la
Remembrance,
Argentina suscribe muy
and
tempranamente, porque
in
firma
the
el Estatuto
Stockholm
de Estocolmo en el año 2000, integra las
Declaration was signed in
la AIRA,
2000,
pero
and
en Argentina
the
evidentemente
IRA
la conmemoración es un evento
declaration
oficial, forma parte del calendario nacional.
it has been taken on by Argentina. It's on January 27th. It's in the midst of our summer holidays, our vacation. But still, in Argentina, we have an unofficial event with the involvement of national activity authorities, which is Yom HaZikaron. And so we have two events. One is recognized by the government, the other one isn't, but both with the participation of government officials. And they have always been there lately. Now, in Argentina, and I have been part of the official committee on behalf of the Ministry of Education of Argentina, this is an event that brings together authorities of the Jewish community and also state officials. And that worked very well up until 2011, 2013, when the MOU with Iran was signed between Christina Kirchner's government, administration, and Iran. You know, things happened in harmony up until then. And that was a turning point, a crisis at the time of that negotiation with Iran. So I believe that this is a venue that has worked very well and still works well. I would not boycott it myself, in Argentina at least. But what I see as a researcher is that during those events, and Yossi was there as well, he's aware, throughout time, the Holocaust was referred to in very different ways. What is interesting, I think, when it comes to Argentina, is to see how those who speak about the Holocaust are very different stakeholders, people from the Jewish community and even politicians from the Peronista movement, conservatives, the radical movement, and others, different political parties, that is. So that is testament to how widespread the memory of the Holocaust is in our country. And let me tell you something. When I wrote this book about the memory of the Holocaust in Argentina, I wanted to write about the Israeli-Arab conflict and talk about it in Argentina. And that was impossible because the intellectuals who talk about this are very much intertwined with political actors. And this creates a huge universe of stakeholders. And I think in Argentina, it would be pernicious for the memory of the Holocaust to boycott this. Joseph Robinson was asking in the chat, you know, it's interesting. How come there's so much anti-Semitism throughout the region? And after the attacks on the state of Israel, on the Israeli embassy in Amia, terrorism is, you know, and the memory of the Holocaust became a vehicle for public sensitivity. And there's a different take on the history and the memory of the Holocaust. And I think it would be counterproductive for us to boycott these movements. And I agree. I think that Mexico is in the same situation. There's a different logic here. But in general, the public political voice is hard to hear. It's usually it speaks very softly. The political voice in public spaces is privatized, so to speak, and that's paradoxical, isn't it? And the voice that speaks more loudly with its constraints and within the borders of the community are the events that are carried out, that are held. So I believe that one of the interesting issues for us to talk about and to pay attention to are the venues where these happen, which have changed. That's very significant as well. What is certain is that the event that will be carried out on the 27th of this month, the official event that will bring more people together, will be held by the community at the Olami school. It's a Jewish school. And then there is the Museum of the Memory and Tolerance Museum in Mexico City. And also there's the Anthropology Museum, which is just a general museum. And that's interesting. And now it's basically, there is an event held there by Christian organizations. They do that every year with different discourses and with several elements that are at play, and we don't have the time to go into that here, but this is an important venue for us to speak, and I think it should be kept as a venue, and the more the voices that are heard in those venues, the better. And on the 27th of this month, I am afraid that there will be very many voices that will be claiming the Holocaust, the Palestinian Holocaust, as they call it, right? So I think it is almost time for us to wrap up. If I may, Judith, there is a colleague, Peter Redden from Australia, who has an interesting question about teaching about Holocaust in the schools in Argentina. And Peter, yes, the answer is yes. In Argentina, the teaching, the Holocaust is taught as part of the official curriculum since 2008. And our federal education system, includes that. But one thing is that, and a different thing is how it is implemented at the state level, the provinces, so that it is there. And the Ministry of Education, between 2008 and 2015, produced a great deal of materials, audiovisuals and written materials about the memory of the Holocaust. I am sorry, Emmanuel, you muted yourself. I'm sorry, I apologize for that. But I am sharing a link in the chat with access to the publications about the Holocaust. They're not the only ones, but these are some of them by the Ministry of Education, Public Education. You'll see that some of them, they're very interesting. And just so you know, Argentina, up until recently, has been the only active country in the Alliance for the Remembrance of the Holocaust, and we are the only ones who have produced materials in Spanish. So UNESCO has disseminated these materials with the Latin American network of countries for the study of the Holocaust, and the same goes for the Sefarad Center in Spain. They have been using our materials to be working with the memory of the Holocaust in the educational institutions in Spain. So we have produced a great deal of materials that have gone beyond our borders. That's all I had to say. Thank you, Judith. So thank you. Thanks to you. I think it's time for us to wrap up. Is there time for one more question? Well, please, go ahead, Luis. Yes, I had to leave because of an emergency. I mean, my son is getting married this weekend, so I had to leave. That's a real emergency, Luis. That's what I call an emergency. I wonder whether you mentioned this, Emmanuel, but I have a question about the Kirchnerism. I think that it left another anti-Semitism legacy together with the military dictatorship, and it was continental in size. And as part of Chavism, all of the Chavism regimes did take anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism on board as part not of their identity, but as part of their platform. There were statements by Kirchnerism, hostility towards the state of Israel in their media, in their mass media. I know you're focused on the past and on Millet and certain aspects, but the influence of Kirchnerism has been really nefarious. And I can mention newspapers such as Página 12. I mean, they are openly hostile to Jews and to Israel. Thank you for your question. Kirchnerism is a very significant experience, and its relationship, its ties to Israel and to Jews is very diverse and pluralistic. In principle, and as Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner said, and I haven't seen as much of this or read as much of this, but he paid many visits to the state of Israel for a long time, and he was there and was engaged in many public events there. And she started, and even in the United States with the American Jewish Committee, etc. And some stakeholders in Kirchnerism and their ties with the state of Israel have had ties that have been a bit not very harmonious. But Luis Delia and Fernando Esteche from Quebracho, I mean, they have been very critical and pro-Iran, but there are other sectors in that world that is linked to Kirchnerism that were not. Hector Timerman, Daniel Filbus, and Axel Pisilov, and others, just to name a few. And they identify with Jews to different degrees, and they were not they did not level criticism at Israel, and maybe had more to do with anti-Semitism. I think that Kirchnerism bears writing about. It's very complex, but there was some deepening in the position of Kirchnerism, not so much against Israel, but for Palestine. I am not an expert in international relations, Luis, mind you, but I don't know to what extent that had to do with their identification with Chavez's regime. But Lula's idea or decision to have a Brazilian embassy in Ramallah, for example, that was followed by Cristina Kirchner. But starting in 2008, the relationship started deteriorating in Argentina and in Brazil as well. I mean, there's been a conflict, but in Argentina, that came to a head in 2013 with the MOU being signed with the Islamic Republic of Iran. So that created a great deal of tension and put an end to dialogue with Israel. And relationships were not the relations were not just strained but severed. And there is an Argentinian researcher who works on that, and I can go back to her, and I'd have to read her work to be able to better answer. Did that not have an influence on Jews or an impact on Jews? Well, it depends on who. After that conflict, Daya really criticized the Kitchener administration, but many Jews and some members of that institution came together in lending their support to the Kirchner administration. So there's a great deal to be said and written about Jews and how they relate to politics and in Argentina. But I can't, I don't have all of that information. I can't answer your question quite clearly. Thank you. Before our session ends, let me wrap up this very interesting session. Emmanuel, thank you so much. And thank you to all of our colleagues here with us today.
colegas que están aquí con
And
nosotros.
we'll meet again in 2 weeks. We will be sending you all of the information for this next session. I would like to send you a warm embrace and thank you. Thank you again. Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you all.
Gracias a todos.
Adiós, muchas gracias.
Un
Bye, bye.
abrazo. Bye.